He was constructing for the future, yes, but also for salvation, and salvation knows no time. Salvation is not just an idea, he murmured. It is another place. The life eternal we must all attain, for men's lives cannot be counted by years, but by virtues. And in the next life, white hairs do not crown the head of he who has lived the longest, but he who has lived best. Hello, everybody. We're going to keep this a lot briefer than last time because an hour-long video damn near broke my phone. It was a nightmare getting it onto my computer, and then it almost crashed my computer the whole time I was editing it. That's not even going to talk about uploading it. So, until I can afford a nicer computer, we're going to sort of rein in on the time here. We're going to keep things shorter. Cannot say the same for old Carlos. We're talking about Terra Nostra. This book is honestly one of the main reasons I was sort of drawn to do a strange thing like starting a YouTube channel. Just because the whole time I was reading this, I kept looking for videos about a book like this because I just wanted to know what the hell it was I was reading. And there's really not a whole lot out there. I think George Coors has like a great hour-long video on this that I did not watch until I finished because when I saw an hour, I was worried it was going to get into spoilers, though. I guess you could spoil a book like this. Yeah, someone's got to talk about this book because there's a lot to talk about, positive and negative, if I'm being honest. I don't even remember where I first came across, where I first heard of this book. It's out of print. I have read The Old Gringo by Fuentes before, much shorter. I liked it. It didn't wow me, but I feel like Fuentes is sort of the third in the sort of trinity or triune, whatever you want to call it, of those sort of writers of the 70s, 80s, 90s who were very influenced by the modernists, but also had a lot of success sort of commercially and critically in that late 20th century space. I feel like in a lot of ways that big three is Cormac McCarthy, Toni Morrison, and Carlos Fuentes. Obviously, if you saw my last video, love Toni Morrison, love Cormac McCarthy, want to love Carlos Fuentes because of that. Struggle with Carlos Fuentes. But also, honestly, this was just, to me, in like November of last year, this was like the scariest book I could think of reading. And while I don't normally subscribe to what I've heard Chris Villa over at Leaf by Leaf call reading as an extreme sport, I wanted a challenge. And I kind of just wanted to see if I could do it. And furthermore, I wanted to see if I could enjoy it, or if I would enjoy it. Though I guess those are two different questions. This is a book that I feel like is almost more known for the challenge of it than for anything that's really in here. You can see I'm not the first owner of this book. Patty D or Die owned it first. And then I got it in 2024, and I'm Patty, no offense, but Patty only made it through the first chapter. I know because she annotated that first chapter really thoroughly, which I appreciated. She's the red and the yellow highlighter, and then I'm the black pen. She appeared to stop after that first chapter, and I can't say I blame her. It's 30 pages, it's intense, it's strange. Yeah, we'll get into it. I'm not going to be summarizing this book, one, because that just feels like a different sort of video, and two, that feels like a sort of Terra Nostra sized task in itself. Like I said, there is a plot, there's a definite plot. I just don't know how you would begin to summarize it, and also, like, I don't know. You'll see. This is the Farrar, Straus and Giroux paperback version from, I believe, the 80s. This book was written in 1975. Patty bought this in 1980, according to her annotation, so I assume this was the first English translation. There have not been that many since. This book is pretty out of print. This edition was translated by Margaret Sayers Peden. Whole time I was reading this, I was just sort of appalled. Obviously writing this must have been a gargantuan task. for Carlos Fuentes. It's 778 pages, which, like, come on, it's this big. It's so chock full of text. Like, we couldn't have made it 777. I don't know, that bothered me, but that's neither Fuentes nor Payton's fault. I don't know if she has translated other English versions of this. I know Dalkey did a paperback version in English a while back. Frankly, I just like this cover way more than the Dalkey version. I really wanted, the Spanish covers are so much, like, well, one is really cool, and one is just hilarious. And I desperately wanted that one, but it's only for the Spanish versions. Now that I've read it, and I'm sure I'll reread it, I think I can justify to myself maybe picking up a copy of the Spanish version just so I have that cover on my shelf. I've tried to learn Spanish. I've given up on that dream. I've given, any language other than English. I've put a lot of time and effort into it. It's just not happening, which sad but true. But I don't think I'm ever going to get to a point with Spanish, certainly where I can read this, but love to have that cover on my shelf. So might make that happen. But anyway, yeah, this is one of two English versions I could find for a decent price online. You got to buy them used. Like I said, it's out of print. I believe I bought this on eBay. After shipping, came out to $25-$30, something like that, which is a lot to spend on a book. But it's a good way to sort of get the sunk cost cranking early and talk yourself into reading it. It's something. I think the place to start with this is just to bring up Joyce as early as possible. I'm on about page 830 of Ulysses right now, and having read this first the whole time, I knew going into it, sort of the word that gets thrown around a lot with Terra Nostra is Joycean. It is very Joycean in its sort of preoccupations in regards to history and sort of the nature of history, how we remember it, how it becomes history, how an event sort of flows from being the present to being history, and the changes it takes over that process. And just these sort of this way of writing where you're trying to capture people's minds and people's consciousnesses as microcosms of all of history. Very Joycean, very reminds me a lot of Ulysses. Also this idea of time being sort of a two-way street, of compressing all of history into one story, is, I feel like Finnegan's Wake also gets brought up a lot. I love Finnegan's Wake. I say I love it. I have not read it in its entirety, but sometimes I just pick it up. I've read, the first chapter or two, and I do love it, just sort of picking it up and flipping to a random page. One of these days I'm gonna knock it out, but not for a while. So yes, it's very Joycean in its preoccupations and its sort of thematic explorations, and in its difficulty, as well as its, shall we say, occasional visceral or maybe even scatological passages. There were some parts in this that had me sort of making faces at the page. There aren't many, but they're there, and you should know that. And of all kinds, of some kinds that were new to me. This takes place largely in Inquisition-era Spain, in the court of Philip II, referred to primarily as El Señor throughout the course of this book. So, there's some Inquisition-type activities going on occasionally. The other writer who it reminded me of a lot is someone else who I think was getting a lot of those sort of the same things that Fuentes was getting from Joyce. I think so was William Faulkner. The prose, the way this book was written, as much as it did, yes, remind me of Joyce, it reminded me more, if I'm being honest, of William Faulkner, and specifically of the Faulkner I've read of Absalom, Absalom. It had that sort of cascading stampede of prose, these long labyrinthine sentences that are just not concerned with your, not concerned with you. They're just doing what they're doing. That famous 1,200 word sentence in Absalom, Absalom, take that and imagine that blown out to 700, almost 800 page book. It is not like that throughout the course of the book, but it often is like that. And even when it is simpler, it takes that and runs with it a little bit. And I think this is also where I want to get into my first criticism of Terra Nostra. I think both Joyce and Faulkner did it better. Terra Nostra, and ultimately this is, I think, my biggest critique of a book that is amazing as an accomplishment, and I walked away being convinced of Carlos Fuentes' intellect and writing ability, and clearly he is about as well read as a person can be, and everything from the Zohar to, you know, deep pre-colonial Mexican history and mythology to you know, European art history. Hieronymus Bosch plays a sort of reoccurring role in this. So while I'm convinced of his intellect and his ability as a writer, and I walked away being like, you know, yeah, you convinced me, Carlos, you can write. It gets lost in itself, I think. I think it is a book a little too worried about convincing you how impressive it is, and not worried enough about creating characters who are that compelling, or a plot that is that compelling, or delivering on the promises it sets up. And I think the sort of Absalomness of the prose is a great example of that. Whereas these, you know, breathless, run-on, stampede sentences that Faulkner uses, especially in Absalom, like that famous, you know, Guinness World Record sentence, that's what, 1,288 words? That is a true 1,288 word sentence. I remember reading John Gardner's The Art of Fiction. There's a passage near the end where he's talking about the long sentences versus short sentences. And he specifically mentions this idea of cheating at long sentences, that some writers, for whatever reason, want to have these really gargantuan sentences so it feels like you're reading something Faulknerian, or you're reading something sort of intense and visceral like that. Or just so they can say, I had a sentence that was this long. But there's a way of cheating at that, which is called semicolons, which is constructing these sentences that are functionally a paragraph of individual sentences that you're just stringing together sort of pseudo-grammatically with semicolons. And so they don't flow in that sort of intense long sentence way. They're functionally a bunch of sentences, and you've just not put a period, you've not put a full stop, so they are one sentence. William Faulkner is the master of a real long sentence, and a long sentence that sort of grabs you by the neck and does not put you down until it's done with you. Carlos Fuentes, I don't want to say he can't do that, but if he can, he doesn't really. The long sentence of this book comes, in this edition, it's 49 pages in. And it is a long sentence. Just to show you, I have it marked off here. You see where that little bracket is? That's where it starts. And there is not a period until there on the next page. It's all that. But El Señor overcame this natural defense, observing the cumbersome cavalrymen drowned in the river and swamp. He had utilized boats along the shore, formerly used to transport foot soldiers, to construct a surer, swifter crossing, Gunwale to gunwale, he lined up the boats and filled them with all the earth. The clever Germans obtained information from deep fishermen about places a man could wade across the lake in waist-deep water. Light at all costs, they advance upon the besieged city. Give every horse a measure of oats. Captains and horsemen must do, without the flag, the service of their squires. Maneuverability. The enemy has lost 4 flags in the battle outside its walls. We must entrench ourselves in that lost ground. Mobility. Set planks across the river. Mark a route through the swamp. The enemy lies in ambush. Cut down trees we might use as refuge or hiding place in the woods along the river. For man and tree are easy to confuse by night. The mills are turning. Mills driven by horsepower. Watermills. Windmills. Praise God. The wind is rising. A strong wind means a swift spreading fire. The German thunder across the causeway of boats. The infantry follows across planks and tightly bound branches. Straw huts in the village. Outside the deep walls burst into flame. The enemy constructs ingenious trenches deep inside, low outside. Now black smoke engulfs the besieged city. They cannot see us, but we can see the buttresses of the wall. Now Asturian miners dig a honeycomb of trenches so that we can reach the boat about the city. Mine the bastions with power so rotten, like the dead, it must be carried in shrouds. Now from the side of the river lost by the enemy, fire the cannon. Tower after tower falls. Ramparts after rampart. We don't hold back now. Days pass. The city resists the siege, but we can smell what's happening inside. The stench of death. Deserters leap from the ravaged towers into the lake. Our vanguard sees the city. Fathers expelled. They come to us and tell us we are peaceful burghers. The Duke and his heretics force us to work like slaves, repairing the walls. If we refuse, we are flogged in public, and if we are recalcitrant, we are hanged. And if we do not accept these terms, we are thrown from the city into the hands of the enemy. The Duke considers this worse punishment than the whip or the gallows. We can tell you that though the city is without provisions or arms, is not lacking in courage. It will defend itself whether with stones or arrows or cauldrons of boiling pitch. For there are many archers and many strong arms, but no cannon or culverin or ordnance. Else your orders to shield themselves against the falling stones and to assure their positions behind the battle walls in crumbling towers, temporary shelters. Thus protect themselves from the defenders and attackers from the stones and arrows of the Duke as well as the cannon and the crossbows of Senor. He ordered his German cavalry position themselves outside the city gate, and the mines were exploded, and the towers of Polish archer finally reached the wall, shouting, yelling, troops into the terrified city. The Duke and heretics fell back and attempted to escape with pistols and daggers, the Germans awaited them fearful squadrons. The black spanner of the Rhine with the coppery represents of those new mercenaries with pistol and dagger. They fell on the heretics. The German shot slaughtered, the Spanish shoveling exploded, and exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, captain of the banner blood planters flying over the highest tower, opened the gates, slowly the door. That was all one sentence. And there are passages where it starts to feel like a true sort of Faulknerian, to keep overusing that word, just a true long sentence where it just it hits a rhythm and it just keeps rolling, right? And it does not let you rest. But that's maybe 50% of that one sentence. And the rest is individual sentences buttressed with semicolons to sort of talk you into this idea of like, this is a difficult book you're reading, and you know, I hope you're down for the ride. And again, it's 50 pages in. It feels, I don't know, it feels like Fuentes was very committed to this idea of writing a difficult Joycean, Faulknerian, a difficult book. He wanted to write his Finnegan's Wake, his Ulysses, his Absalom, his The Waves, his, you know, whatever. It's not like The Waves, but, you know, it's that sort of difficult. He wanted to write a difficult book. And this book would have been plenty difficult without all this extra legwork he put in to make it extra difficult. And that ultimately is, I think, the flaw of the book, is that he was more committed to the idea of the book as a difficult work and as an impressive work, it feels as a reader, than he was to making the book as compelling as it could be. And that's ultimately, I think this book showed me a lot about the difference between a book that's interesting on an intellectual level and a book that's compelling on a fiction level. And this book was very interesting. I was engaged the whole time. I did not get bored. Keeps you guessing. You never know what's going to happen next. I don't think it's compelling at all on an emotional level. I could not find a single character who, likable or dislikable, who I found compelling. The plot, while it was interesting and very unexpected in every turn it takes, unexpected in a good way, in an expert way, it didn't have me wondering. It had me wondering what was going to happen next, but more at a like, oh, what am I in for? Not in a, it was not an emotionally compelling book to me at all. And I think ultimately, when you're undertaking to write a difficult book like this, the expert level question, the task that you're up against, is how to do all this that makes it intellectually interesting and strange and difficult in a way that does not diminish or take precedence over the basic emotional requirements of fiction, of good fiction. And again, I mentioned this in my last video. As I'm reading Ulysses, obviously it's sort of a masterclass in writing a difficult, intellectually engaging book. Ultimately, though, a lot of times I feel like the style gets out of hand, and the style starts to be a hindrance to the substance. And as I said in the last video, I think sort of, to me, from what I've read, the ultimate book where the style is bonkers and difficult, and you have to read it over and over and over, but it is also incredibly emotionally engaging and compelling, and it creates these really fascinating characters. It is Absalom, Absalom. That's the best I've seen it done. I'll talk about Ulysses more in a future video once I finish it, but Fuentes, even more than Joyce, I feel like, because he's not Joyce, try as he might, and he's great. He's an incredible writer. But I think he gets lost in his own intellect, and I think we do too as readers. At least I certainly did, and I don't find it that compelling to be lost in Carlos Fuentes' intellect. A lot of this book is devoted to architecture, in the sense that a lot of the plot revolves around Philip II constructing this enormous palace / mausoleum that he sees as his life's work, or maybe his death's work. Architecture plays a big role in the plot. And Fuentes talked about, apparently, wanting this book to be an architectural experience, wanting this book to feel like this palace, as this palace is getting built, where there's like circling around a courtyard, and there is it's expansive and yet very thought out and very solid. And that ultimately, I think, is sort of, for a long, difficult book like this, the question is one of sprawl versus architecture. So where a book like Ulysses, or honestly a book like Absalom absolutely sprawls, Fuentes seemed to really want this book to feel constructed, to feel intentionally laid out. It's done in 3 parts, triptych style. Like I said, Bosch is sort of a recurring character, though it's rarely mentioned by name. The Garden of Earthly Delights, the painting, plays a huge role. There is 3 parts, the Old World, and then the New World, which comes about 350 pages in, and that it's about novella length, about 120 pages, and then the Next World is what the third part is called, the Next World, but from what I understand, there is some controversy over that translation, and potentially a better translation would be the Other World. Like I said, I don't speak Spanish, I can't speak to that, but it's a very designed book, and it progresses as such. And where I think that design is strong, it is really compelling. The part 1 is difficult, both because you're just getting a sense of how Fuentes is going to be doing this, and it takes a while to sort of get in that rhythm. But it's also, I think, more difficult, and it has some of the most hard to read and understand passages of the book. But in addition to that difficulty, it's really strong. It's really interesting. And it sets up both a sort of mystery plot and questions you want answers to thematically. You want to see where this is going. And it is a real masterclass in this slow unfurl of information in a way that really keeps you guessing. It kept me specifically coming back to this character list. I often kind of roll my eyes when a book has a character list, because a lot of times, there's like 100 Years of Solitude where you need that just to keep track of who everyone is. That's cool. There's plays. Obviously, I'm not mad when a play has a personae dramatis or whatever it is. A lot of times when a novel has it, it just feels like a gimmick. I thought that's what this was. This actually winds up, I don't want to say it plays a role in the plot, but as it continued to play out and I kept flipping back and forth between these characters who you're sort of slowly coming to understand who they are, and the character list. Even how they were described in the character list, you realize is so intentionally put there to reveal information at the right time. Fantastic. Again, part one, difficult, 300 pages, 350 pages. Very strong, very interesting, and a masterclass of like a slow roll out of information. Took me the longest of the parts of the book. Part two, I think I read in like 2 or 3 days. Like I said, it's 120 pages, and it feels like Carlos Fuentes throwing you a bone a little bit. It is way easier in the way it's told. It's a framed story. It is a story being told by one of the characters from part one in its entirety. So there's none of this perspective shifting, and it is all spoken. So there's none of this stream of consciousness, internal monologue, hyper-modernist writing. It's just a good story. And it is sort of a self-contained story. If this book weren't going to run you $30, I would say, honestly, get this book and first just read part two. Just read The New World as a novella. It's great. And then from there, when you're ready for it, you can tackle the whole thing. Part two was wonderful. And sort of Fuentes showing that in addition to that difficult, dense, modernist part one writing, he can also just pull off a great story. And thematically, there's a lot of depth to that part two, as sort of easy as it is in comparison to part one. It's still not easy, but it's in comparison, it's such a breather. And then you're just shy of 500 pages in, and you got about 300 to go. And part three is when he lost me. And this is where I feel like the architecture starts to fall apart, and Fuentes gives in to sprawl a little bit, but in a way where he's trying not to, and therefore the sprawl does not work the way it does in a book like Ulysses. That's so sprawling, but sprawling in a way that's all happening in one or two characters' minds. Or Absalom, where it is sprawling, but there is such a it's being told by a couple of people and told about the same people, and so the way it sprawls is not so much the feeling that Faulkner's like sort of he's been juggling and he's starting to drop the balls. It's that you're sort of, it's adding the depth that is necessary to Absalom. That's going to take its own video. Absalom, but I'm gonna have to gear up for that, honestly, more than I did for this. Part three, it gives way to sprawl, but in a way that feels unintentional, and like Fuentes is just sort of losing control over he's failing to rein in this sort of all of these ideas that he has and all of these things he wants to do. And the plot, he's now introduced all these characters that sort of split off. It just fractures. And in a way that while the last page or so, in a similar way to 100 Years of Solitude, where you're like, how the hell is he going to wrap this up? And in that last page specifically, I was like, okay, that was a great last page. You left me feeling satisfied. As time went on, I finished this a couple months ago. As time has gone on, I feel less satisfied with the book as a whole, and I feel like part three just did not, I don't want to say it failed to deliver on the promises of the first two parts, because it was still great and very interesting. But that was really where I felt Carlos Fuentes getting lost in the sauce, and lost in his own ideas and how interesting his own ideas were. And ultimately, I think that is the failure of this book, is that it has too many ideas to hold and not enough emotionally compelling content to hold it up. Yeah, it's a book worth reading. it's a book I'm glad I read and a book I'm confident I'll reread someday, not anytime soon. And if you enjoy these difficult modernist books, if you like James Joyce, if you like Virginia Woolf, if you like, if you like 100 Years of Solitude, and are looking for something to challenge you even more, but have that sort of just this effect of reading it and you're just wondering where it's going to go next. It's absolutely worth reading. And I think it is a masterclass in how to write a long, difficult book, both in the things it does well and in the things I think it doesn't do well. I feel like I learned a lot from sort of trying to pinpoint where it went wrong for me. Still overall, though, a very good book, and a very impressive book, and a massively impressive book to have translated. I kind of want to read Payton's other translations just to sort of see what else she's up to after this. But yeah. Terra Nostra, if you're feeling like a challenge, look no further.